Chapter 35. Mr. Johnson returns home. When we arrived at Heneliku's house, he told me, "There is one thing I have to do when Mr. Johnson returns to Kalai. Come back and pick me up, and we will all go and see him." I told him it would be a pleasure. Elena and I then drove back to Naalehu, to Mr. Kupahu's residence. He came to the door to meet us, and we all went into the house. He was having his lunch, so we joined him. After lunch, I walked into the living room and rested on the couch. In a few seconds, I was fast asleep. When I woke up, Mr. Kupahu was sitting out on the veranda, taking in the nice cool breeze. I pulled up a chair and sat alongside of him. I had lots of things on my mind to tell him about what had happened at the Ho'oponopono seance. I knew Mr. Kupahu was anxious to hear the results, so I told him all the details of what had happened. Then I said, "Heneliku's doing this was very good work, accomplished to help someone who didn't understand the Hawaiian religion of the old days. Even you, with your new religion, you cannot help Mr. Johnson. But if you use the old Hawaiian religion and understand the new religion, you can be a big help to those who come to you. This is why you must tell everything you know, because you help people like me trying to find out about the old religion. I know you were taught about all these things that I have seen done by Heneliku, and you ignore them. If one of your own had done the same as Mr. Johnson, you would forget your Christian idea and look for a kahuna to do the Ho'oponopono seance, and at the same time, you would see a doctor. I know you would do that." He looked at me and said, "It is true." I said, "You know lots of things that I want you to tell me because it is important. When you leave me, you take all what is good with you. If you let me know, I can keep it in writing, and whoever reads my book will carry it out to help others. This is something you can always say. Whatever I have to contribute is my share to my Hawaiian culture and heritage." I spoke to him about the extermination of the spirit by catching it with his right hand. I didn't see the spirit, but a substance, as the yolk of an egg as he squeezed it in his palm and it flowed down his wrist. Mr. Kupahu explained to me, "When he is in a trance, he cannot see the spirit. You and I don't see. When he catches it, he communes with the spirit to accept the leniency. There is always bargaining going on. If it is acceptable, he then releases the spirit. Otherwise, he squeezes, and that is the end at that time. There is a lot more to do than you think. What I don't like is the harassment. Then you must find another kahuna to do the okina phase. To undertake this phase is almost like the Ho'oponopono seance. There are many other seances, too numerous to mention, but I will tell you all that I know. There are some I have heard of, but am not familiar with. These are important in some cases." Then I spoke to Mr. Kupahu about the extermination of the spirit by my grandfather in Pahoa, and the next day one of the neighbors died without cause. In other words, he died through the hands of a kahuna. Later, I heard the gossip of my grandmother and my aunt spoken in Hawaiian, and I understood. At that time, I paid little attention. Later, when my grandmother came to Kalapana, my mother asked her, and she told the truth. From then on, I was always curious about the extermination of the spirit, but my mother warned me not to get involved because it was too dangerous. As I grew older, I got more interested about writing about it instead of trying to learn. After listening to my mother, I believed her, and I am glad I did. I then decided that Elena and I would go to Pahala and see Mr. Johnson. I told her as soon as she was through with her washing, we would leave. I asked Mr. Kupahu if he wanted to go, but he said it would be too late when we returned, as it would be past his bedtime. He thanked me for encouraging him to keep his Hawaiian beliefs instead of discarding them. I got in the car, and Elena was in the front seat waiting for me. On the way, we stopped at Mr. Siu's restaurant at Honuapo and met him at the back of the house. He was glad to see us. I asked him how everything was with him. He told me business was fair and he would rather stay there instead of returning to Hilo. He asked what we were doing there. I replied, I came here for a vacation. In a few weeks, I will return to Pahoa to see my parents and go to Honolulu to work for the United States Naval Air Station. I asked him to prepare a meal for Elena and me. I told him, I am going to Pahala to see Mr. Johnson. He is a relative of mine, and he was hurt falling on the battery prongs that punctured his intestines. He is doing all right as far as the hospital report. Mr. Siu said, he brought me half a bag of ahole some time ago. It was fat and juicy. I hope he has some more when he is well. When you see him, let him know I wish him well. While we were eating, Mr. Siu and I talked about a lot of things. Some of the subjects reminded me of when I was in Hilo. He used to be a salesman when I was the manager of the Royal Film Corporation. He always stopped at the office, and we talked of business. After our meal, we both thanked Mr. Siu and left for Pahala Hospital. It was getting dark when we arrived. I stopped at the desk and asked to see Mr. Johnson. The nurse directed us to his room. As we entered, he was sitting up in bed and he was smiling as we went up to greet him. I told him all about the incidents that had happened since he was taken to the hospital, and that we were happy and grateful to Heneli Ku for straightening out this matter. I told him, there is one more thing to be done when you return home. I have to bring him back to Kalai. He has to perform the Okina phase. This is the phase where the line is drawn, and that means the human from the spirit, which states, you go your way and I go my way. This is the last act performed that will release you from the spirit harassment. When this is done, Heneli Ku will have completed his work. I will call you before I bring Heneli Ku to Kalai. I asked Heneli Ku to stay over one day after the last phase. I think we should give him a little party of Thanksgiving for his kokua. Don't you agree with me? Mr. Johnson replied, by all means, it's a good idea. I said, now comes the main subject. I must let you know that I have followed this story from the beginning when you told me about the ahole 3 miles out at Kalai, and the only thing that could bring the fish in was the ku'ula o makale. You got the ku'ula and the fish. You got paid for the fish, and you forgot to give a bounty of 1 measly fish and received this accident. Mrs. Johnson knew what to do and called me to get Heneli Ku to do the Ho'oponopono seance. He did and asked for leniency. The keeper of the ku'ula refused. In refusing, I understand, it would complicate your recovery. To make things easier was the next move. He had to exterminate the keeper's spirit. They call this uhane po'i. When this was done, the ku'ula had no keeper and the taboo law was broken. But to be made permanent, he must use the okina phase. This is the last of the performance. When this is done, you will be back to normal, the same as before the accident. I want to hear from you, your account of this accident, but before you decide, let me make something clear. To clarify your mind, what you have to form is a true opinion, whether this accident was a coincidence or not. If not, then the accident was the result of the taboo system having been violated. According to my opinion, what Heneliku has done has only one answer. It was not a coincidence. Mr. Johnson replied, "It was not a coincidence. Before I fell on the battery jars, I did not slip on the stool. I had one hand holding to the iron bar that is secured to the wall. This is a safety bar to protect me when taking battery jars in and out. I felt like someone pushed me from behind. It happened so fast, the next thing I remember there was something sticking in my intestines, and just at that time, Domingo came and helped me. I have done this all the time, and it never happened to me before. I am glad I have your side of the story, which completes what I wanted to know." It was getting late, and I told Mr. Johnson I thought we should go home to Naalehu. So we both bid him good night and told him we would wait for his call so that I could get Heneliku to come. The night was clear and the stars were shining, but there was no moon. As we drove along the highway, I looked, and we were about to enter into a kukui nut orchard near Hilea. As we entered, I saw a round ball colored bright yellow just floating through the branches of the kukui nut trees. I stopped the car and walked a few feet to see this round ball of fire the Hawaiians call a kualele, or the flying spirit. I stood about 10 yards away and watched as it floated. To me, it seemed to float in circles. Then it stopped and descended to about 3 feet from the ground. Then it started to go up above the branches and disappeared. This took about 15 minutes. When it disappeared, the forest became black. I walked back to the car. Elena was sleeping. I woke her up and told her about the ball of fire, but I did not want to frighten her. I only wanted to know the truth about this. I was sure this ball of bright yellow was probably some kind of gas escaping from the forest. I would ask Mr. Kupahu. He might be able to enlighten me. When we came into the house, Mr. Kupahu was up writing a letter. Elena made hot chocolate and served it with cake. Then Elena went to bed, and I stayed up with Mr. Kupahu. I told him about Mr. Johnson and what he said about his accident. He said, "There can be no doubt but what Heneliku did was the correct procedure in such a case like this." Then I told him what I saw when we came near Hilea camp. Mr. Kupahu said, "This is some kind of spirit wandering with no place to rest." He asked me how big was this yellow ball, and I told him about the size of an egg. He said, "This round ball you saw is the same as that which Heneliku and your grandfather at Pahoa squeezed in their palm, but which you did not see floating. This ball you saw was harmless." I asked him, "Did you ever come in contact with the Akualele?" He replied, "I did, but the funny part was that I was standing and looking at the object, and all at once it came in front of me. I was not frightened, but only curious, so I stretched out my right hand and caught the yellow ball. To my amazement, the object just moved away from my hand without my feeling it." Then he remembered only a kahuna could stop this because he has the mana, or power, over the spirit. This akualele will float until it comes to a cave to rest. This is one of the mysteries that I came in contact with, which I cannot explain. It was getting late, and I suggested to Mr. Kupahu that I thought it was about time we both went to bed. Next morning, I got up and walked into the backyard to see the garden. I picked some tomatoes and leaf onions for my lunch and went back to the house and set the vegetables in the kitchen. Breakfast was ready, so we sat down to eat. After breakfast, I went into the living room to do some of my writing about the things Mr. Kupahu had told me. For 2 days, I was going to take it easy. I kept Mr. Kupahu busy answering my questions. I felt I must get from him all that I needed to know. It was tedious work, but it served my purpose, and Mr. Kupahu was a big help. I remember he told me to drive Elena and him to Naalehu, toward the mountain back of Hilea. We came to one hill that he called a mountain, and he told me to stop, and we walked to a stone wall fence. We went over it and walked about 50 yards. The ground was of lava formation, with lots of large rocks piled one on the other. He stopped and sat on a rock, and we all did the same. All the time, I was anxious to know what he was going to tell me. During the still moments as we sat on the rock, I heard the sound of rushing water right under where I sat. Then he said, "Can you hear that sound?" I told him it sounded like rushing water underneath the rocks. He told me that it was a big underground lake of fresh water. This lake was somewhere in the mountains near Hilea Uka. During the drought in Naalehu, his grandparents would go up the mountain with wooden calabashes on a pack of donkeys. When they returned, the calabashes were filled with fresh mountain water. The water was sweet and cold. In one of the umekis also were some freshwater prawns, which he loved to eat. During the weekend, they would go up into the mountains and spend a few days. They would ask him to come along, but he always put it off. He told them when he was ready to go, he could find the lake, but it did not dawn on him that this was a special lake. His grandparents would say to him in Hawaiian, "Ia kala e hiki mai e mihi oi no kou ho'olohe ole." The day will come that you will regret for not listening. His grandparents died and left him alone. He was then working for the plantation. During his employment with the plantation, nothing happened. Then one year, the drought came. He began to recollect about how his grandparents got water and freshwater shrimps, so he went up to the mountain at Hilea in search of the underground freshwater lake. He stayed for a week and found no lake. He was so disappointed and remembered the very words that his grandparents told him. He said to himself, "How stupid can he be?" He sat down on some rocks lying over the place. He was tired, and pretty soon he fell fast asleep. When he woke up, it was late in the evening. While he was lying down, everything was quiet, but during that time, he heard the rushing of the water below him. He listened again and said to himself, "It is true. I have found the freshwater lake, but where is the entrance?" He walked back to Naalehu that night. The next morning, he told his story to the plantation superintendent. They made a survey by drilling holes and poured red dye in and watched the shoreline for the red marker. None ever reached the ocean. After that, he said it served him right for not listening and going with his grandparents when they asked him to, for his own benefit. This was something he could not forget because it was true. He drank the water and ate the prawns. He was interested in showing me the location and telling me the story because I wanted to write his story. I promised him I would write it and maybe someone would find this underground freshwater lake. We walked back to the car and returned home to Naalehu. I told Mr. Kupahu that when I wrote my story, I would write just what he told me. Maybe someone will read it and find the answer to finding the long-lost underground lake. If it is found, I will be sure to dedicate it to his name. As we were having dinner, Mr. Shimizu came in and said Mrs. Johnson had left word that Mr. Johnson was back home. I told Elena that the next morning we would pick up Heneliku and take him to Kalai. We all got up early and Elena prepared breakfast. I thought Mr. Kupahu would come with us to go to Kalai, but he said he had some gardening to do with his young papaya plants, which he wanted to transplant along the stone wall. Before lunch, we were at Kalai with Heneliku. We all walked into the house and met the family. Mr. Johnson was glad to see Heneliku. He asked all of us to stay for the night, and we accepted. This was the only way Heneliku could perform his last rite. I also wanted to see it, as it was so important to me. I then walked to the lighthouse and saw the altar stone once more. There was no ku'ula or school of fish to see. After dinner that evening, we all sat in the living room. Heneliku brought in a bowl half full of water. He threw in a dab of Hawaiian salt while he invoked a prayer of reconciliation. He dipped in a tea leaf and sprinkled it on Mr. Johnson and said these words, "You no longer are in bondage to your taboo. Hereby you are immune and free from any of the taboo. It is, therefore, I command that the ku'ula o Makale stay buried among the dead in the burial cave at Makale. Amen." This was the end of the Okina. That very moment, the scene returned to its normal way of life. We began to talk of different things. They all asked me what I was going to do. I told them I was very glad to get all the information. I wanted to know about the ku'ula called Makale, but I never expected it would happen in Kalai. The next day, we started for home. It was 9 in the morning. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson thanked Heneliku for his help during their troublesome time, which would long be remembered. Also, they thanked Elena and me for helping them all through that time. It was a morning full of emotion as we parted. There is a time, it is written, that everything will come to an end, and this was it. As I started the car and drove away, I could see the tears in their eyes. I was so filled with emotion, I could not say a word. Before we regained our composure, we were at Heneliku's residence. Elena and I walked side by side with Heneliku into his house. We sat on the veranda and both looked at him. I thought, this is one of the saddest moments of my life. When I leave him, it will be the last time. But Elena and I would always remember him. We both kissed him and said goodbye. I started up the car and drove off without looking back. We arrived at Naalehu about lunch hour and sat down to lunch with Mr. Kupahu. I said to him, "We have done our work, and now I can rest for a few days and return to Pahoa to see my parents." After lunch, we sat on the veranda and spoke of what we had in our minds. After our conversations, I told Mr. Kupahu I thought I would go for a short walk. I was thinking of walking back of the house that led to the open plain. That was where the cave was that I took the ku'ula o Kalawa to rest. I took my camera and started walking. It was only a distance of about 1 mile. I was thinking of taking a picture to show my mother. As I neared the cave about 10 feet from the entrance, I took a picture just to show the landmark where the entrance was. I walked to the entrance, or hole in the ground, and went down inside. I looked around and saw the ku'ula lying on the ground. As I gazed at it, The ku'ula was just another piece of ordinary rock. I spoke to it. I am going to take your picture. I have to take you up to the sunlight. After I am through, I will return you back. I hope you will accept. Thank you. I did just that. Before I left, I spoke again. I am leaving you here, and I am returning home. Your picture will be with me as something to remember, as an old friend. I said goodbye and left the cave and walked back to the house. All the time I was thinking that Heneliku told me to return the ku'ula to the cave, and I knew he was right.